start, I thought I'd begin with a story. And as some of you might have noticed, I'm a woman of kind of slightly above average height, which as an adult is fabulous, except for the fact that all the really cool shoes have got heels like this, which is really frustrating because I can't walk in them and I can't buy them, especially because my husband is 3 centimeters shorter than I am. So not that that's an issue or anything. That's all. But as a young person, as a kid, it wasn't always so easy being tall. And I wonder if you can spot me in the picture on the right, or the left, on this one. The picture is on the right. Yeah, can you spot me? No? I am the one whose head is about 1.5 heads taller than everybody else in the front row that's showing her knickers. Yeah, that's me. That's me. And that's obviously also me on the left with a really great 80s haircut. So as you can imagine, in the kind of struggle as a teenager to fit in and to belong and to be cool, that wasn't always the easiest thing for me as a kid. And I went to a school where, although nothing was written in the prospectus of kind of this is what you need to do in order to belong, we all knew it. Those of us who belonged and those of us who didn't all knew what the criteria were. And as a young woman, the criteria was to be pretty, to be able to talk to boys, and to be curriculum bright. And I was none of these. I was political, I was independent thinking, I liked basketball and not netball. I was more interested in the history in the making than a history that had only one narrative and not many. And so the struggle to really fit in and find my place at school was really difficult. And that culture of belonging was something that was co-created by students and staff together, unconsciously, through what was affirmed and what was not affirmed. And I remember one day arriving at school with yet another social activist project that I wanted to introduce to the school. And I went to see the deputy principal. And I gave her this fabulous idea. And she said to me, "Look, Elana, I'm not sure that your politics are quite what we need at this school. And I think you need to be focusing on your proper education." And as Geeta spoke this morning, that for me was one of those moments. It was one of those moments where in that engagement, what I learned was that what I was being told was that organizations, and this is a school that was liberal in its prospectus, was open in its prospectus. And what I learned in that moment was that organizations could say one thing and be incongruent in their behaviors in another. I learned in that moment that what was deemed proper education had nothing to do with social justice and equality, and everything to do with academic attainment and getting better results than the person next to you. In that moment, I learned that power had as much to do with social status as financial wealth, as academic attainment. And in that moment, I learned that if you wanted to fit in, you needed to conform to somebody else's rules, and you needed to compromise on who you were. And that was a hugely difficult lesson to learn as a teenager. So jump some years on, and I'd been doing work in education and youth empowerment for a number of years. And then I started to do work in leadership and organizational development. And I had the privilege of working with a team of facilitators from across sub-Saharan Africa on a leadership program, working with CEOs of companies from the private sector, with heads of NGOs, with people from the public sector. We brought them all together from across sub-Saharan Africa to have conversations about leadership, about value-based leadership. And the idea, the big picture, was to be able to create a shift in consciousness on the continent. And it was an amazing experience, really remarkable. And in that time, I had the opportunity to work with a woman named Monica Sharma. And Monica Sharma headed up the UN leadership agenda at the time. And she's about yay high, maybe actually even about yay high. And she's a real powerhouse. She is the most amazing woman. If anybody, has anybody here met her?
She spoke at our last conference.
So she's amazing.
2 conferences ago.
So she's amazing, absolutely amazing. So Monica, as I'm sure for those of you who've then heard her, she really encouraged us to connect with our values, with our passion, with that which is really core to us. And she spoke about how we needed to be thinking about not just tweaking dysfunctional systems, but fundamentally shifting dysfunctional systems. And in the process of doing that, in working with her, I kind of reconnected with what it was the impact I wanted to make on the world. And so I went back into education, into the work around education, alongside my work around in corporates. And in that context, I went to a conference in London, an education conference, that was to profoundly change the way I looked at schools and the way I worked. And it was a conference that was held in London, and on the panel, there was a woman who was the head teacher of a hospital school. So her school was attached to a children's hospital. And she posed a question to us that I'd like to offer you. And she said to us, the reality for me is that most of the children that I work with will not live beyond the age of 12. If you knew that the children that you were working with would not live beyond the age of 12, and you were a teacher, what would you teach them? So I'd like you to take literally 30 seconds to turn to the person next to you and have a conversation, a really quick conversation. If you were a teacher in a school and you knew your children wouldn't live beyond the age of 12, what would you teach them? Okay, so if you can push the pause button on those conversations. If you can push the pause button on those conversations, and if we can just hear, we don't need any, hello. I have a colleague that I work with who used to be a head teacher, and he says you can always tell the difference between us, because I go, hello, sorry, can I just have everybody's attention up here? And he's like, okay, can everybody just sit down and be quiet? We don't need mics or anything. If people can just call out, what are some of the things that you would teach those children? Fun, love, joy, passion, curiosity, presence. Yeah, what else? Appreciation of everything. Yeah? Wonderment. Okay, great. Come again? Live your purpose. Exactly. So that was very similar to the kind of things we came up with. We spoke about the desire to teach children about values, that they were loved, that they could feel loved, that they were cared for, that they belonged. And it left me thinking, if that's what you would teach a child who lives to the age of 12, why is that not what we would teach children who live to the age of 92 and who are going to fundamentally be impacting on our world and co-creating the world that we live in? I just don't get it. And I think there was something about that experience that made me fundamentally shift in the way in which I thought about schools and the impact that I wanted to make in the arena of schools. And schools historically have been the place where we pass down from one generation to the next the core information that we think is of value for our world. And historically, this has been to prepare young people for the world of work. And that's been kind of bound up in the taught curriculum. And while the taught curriculum has definitely shifted over the years, I'm not sure, I don't know about any of you, but I'm not sure I would pass a year 10 maths class now. I could barely pass it when I was in school, but I certainly couldn't pass it now. And my nieces, I support my nieces in some of their reading and things, and they're way ahead of where I was at their age. But at the same time, the fundamental criteria of what is deemed success in schools hasn't actually changed that much. Although our world has actually changed kind of profoundly. And when I go out and I speak with CEOs of companies and I speak with HR directors, what I'm hearing from them is that we need a different set of skills from young people who are coming into the world of work. We need them to be resilient. We need them to be able to work in an interconnected way. We need them to be able to not just regurgitate facts, but be able to fundamentally go out there and find the facts, because the facts are continuously changing. We need them to be able to not just conform and follow rules, but be able to actually sense what are the rules that are needed at this given moment, and are these the right rules, and do they connect with values? And if they don't connect with values, how do I impact on creating a different set of rules that do connect with values? They talk about the need for young people to be able to work collectively and be able to realize that the greatest innovations and the greatest wisdom comes from collective wisdom rather than the individual star. And this is a really different set of skills than when I was at school some time ago, and some 20 years or so ago. And I think that what we're noticing is that the jobs, the kind of what we're needing to be educating young people for is not just to make a living, but equally to make a life. And we need to be able to be educating young people in the knowledge that we're educating them for jobs that have yet to be invented, with knowledge that we don't yet know, to be doing things that we can't even imagine. So how are we actually preparing young people for that reality? So at this point in my journey, I came across somebody who was going to become one of my closest colleagues and closest friends, and his name is John Bazalgette. And John is in his mid-70s, and we've been working together for about the last 3 years. And I think the gift of working with John is that he is in his mid-70s. And there's a very different, we bring very different things. There's something like 30 years between us. And every now and again, I'll run ahead and John will be like, oh, can you just come back here a little bit? I don't quite get it. Or he'll run ahead more often and I'll be like, oi, John, can you just come back here a bit? So it's a really dynamic relationship, and it's a very innovative relationship. And together, John and I have developed a project called Ubuntu for Life. And I'll come back to that in a moment. But Ubuntu for Life was really grounded in research that was done by John and the Grubb Institute. He's part of the Grubb Institute. And some years ago, John did some research into 3 schools, and they were failing schools. And all 3 schools got turned around to become the best schools in their area. And when John went in to try and discover what had been the ingredient that had turned those schools around, because the intake was identical. The staff team was identical. The only thing that had changed was the head teacher. And when he did research and he spoke to parents, governors, teachers, students, what he discovered was the key ingredient that all 3 of those head teachers brought in was a sense of belonging. They created an environment in the school where the school community felt that they belonged to the school and that the school belonged to them. He found that there was firm alignment between what the values were as they were written and what the values were as they were practiced. And he found that there was clear alignment between the children's understanding of values and the practice of that in the school. And what came out of the research was the profound importance of children feeling a sense of belonging to a school, but equally children's sense of connectedness to the values and purpose of the school. And this reaffirmed a study that was done by somebody named Rutter, who did a research in something like 70-odd schools across London, both secondary and primary schools. And again, he found that where you've had firm alignment to purpose, to values, to ethos in schools, there was a greater sense of attachment and a greater sense of attainment. So even for those people who decide to judge schools purely on attainment, purely on academic attainment, they too need to be paying attention to that element of belonging, because it is through that attachment and that belonging that students flourish. And so coming out of all of this, John and I, as I say, came together to create Ubuntu for Life. And Ubuntu for Life draws on, as the heading says, the African concept of Ubuntu. And that's kind of popped up in different places over the last few days. And encapsulated in Ubuntu is the idea of our interconnectedness, the idea of I belong, therefore I am. And what we look to see, how do we move from the me to the we paradigm? And how can we be engendering this in schools, but also in communities? Do you think that's the universe telling me I need to let go of the notes? So there's something about, and so in that process, it felt of John and I developing this work, there was something about really connecting to our purpose. What was the impact that we wanted to make, the legacy we wanted to make, that we felt was burning? And in my conversation earlier, I really connected again, that Ashley and I had, I really connected again to that feeling of this is why we need to do this work. And we need to be doing something in schools. And this was the offer that John and I gave to the schools. And the project works in primary and secondary schools. And these are quotes from head teachers who were involved in the project. And the top one I thought was great because it's from a primary school. And that's the way in which all the teachers have drawings of themselves by the children. And what we try to do in the schools is to be really shifting the culture in schools, shifting the consciousness of all the different members of the school community, to be thinking about their interconnectedness, to be thinking about how they are collectively creating a culture of belonging. And I was hoping to have a short video clip, but it's being literally edited and done as we speak. So instead, what I wanted to offer you was this, which is a collage of some of the pictures and drawings of children who have been involved in sessions to be exploring that concept of Ubuntu, that concept of interconnectedness. And in the center of that, you can look here too, in the center of the slide, you can see that picture. And that was a drawing by a young boy in year 3. And he had been misbehaving in his class. He'd been really rowdy and not being kind of sitting quietly. And so he was sent off to go and sit in the class of the deputy principal. And it was a year 6 class, and she happened to be teaching an Ubuntu class. So she was exploring with them, what does this concept mean? What does it mean to be interconnected as students to each other? What does it mean to be interconnected as students to the community? So they were exploring all the different phrases. And then she said to them, they were working with the idea, it takes a village to raise a child. And she asked them, can you draw for me your ideal village? That's what he drew. You can see it really clearly. And when he was asked to describe the village, he said, well, in the center of the village, and I'm not going to try and do this you can see it in the center of the village, there's a bell tower. And he said early in the morning, it was his job to get up and climb to the top of the bell tower and ring the bell. It was a very important job because that told everybody that they had to get up and go and work in the fields, to go and create food for the village. And at the end of the day, he had to walk up to the bell tower and had to ring the bell again. And at that point, that would tell everybody to come back to the village to share the food and to be able to talk to one another before going to bed. And there's something for me, I think, quite profound in the fact that here was this 7-year-old who got it. He got that idea of how each member of that community works to create the betterment of that community. And actually, in the here and now moment, for those of you who haven't seen it yet, on the board outside, there's a poster, there's a flip chart with a message from a group of children who have done the personal values, and they have written up some stuff on the flip chart. And if you haven't read it yet, go and read it and send a message. Because I tell you, and they were 7 and 9, is that correct, Chris? Chris, 7 and 9. And they've got it. They've totally got it. And here was this child who totally got it. And when we spoke to them afterwards and said to them, what did you think of the lesson? He was like, it was the best lesson ever. And we said to him, what do you think about Ubuntu? He was like, it's brilliant. Like, do you need any further affirmations? And what we're also discovering is that the inspectors, the Ofsted inspectors, who are the education inspectors, are also getting it. they identified this as being something that they were noticing, shifting the culture within the schools that we've been working in, which is really, really exciting. So, now I need to reconnect with where I am. So there was something in that process of kind of working with the children and young people that reaffirmed for us, that's where I was going, that reaffirmed for us the importance of starting this work early, not waiting until later, but starting this work early. And Otto Sharma spoke about, in his book, Presencing, Illuminating the Blind Spot of Leadership, spoke about the idea of presencing, of looking to the future, rather than looking to the past to solve our current problems. Look to the future, to the yet unknown, and be able to sense what's there and actualize it. And for me, that's a core part of what this is about. It's a core part of how are we working with that which is in the future, the next generation of leaders, in the now, in the present of the moment. And he spoke also in his book about that idea of social fielding, where, and the analogy he spoke about was of the agricultural field, where you've got the visible field on the surface, and you've got the hidden field, the organism that's pulsating underneath, and that together they create the crops. And for me, that was a really powerful image, partly because I'm a farmer's daughter and I love gardening, but partly because it really spoke to me to that importance of that which is hidden below the surface. And for me, there's something about in our schools, how are we paying attention, and not even just in our schools, but more generally, how are we paying attention to the hidden field that is so essential in the way in which our next generations of young people are being educated? What are the hidden messages that we're telling them about power, about congruency, about values? How are we really engendering that in our next generation of leaders? And it used to be for me that this work I would do because it was the right thing to do, because children had rights under the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child, because it was morally and ethically right. And while I think that is still what drives me, I think I do this work now because we need it. Because our world is changing, and if we don't pay attention to the next generation now, we are going to be replicating the same issues in the future. And the last 3 days I've sat here, and that's really affirmed for me that if we are wanting to have conscious capitalism, if we are wanting to have value-based leaders, yes, we can do that work when they're adults, and yes, we should. But this feels like an absolute imperative to be rethinking the way in which we are educating our young people now, and the way in which our schools are educating our young people, and be really challenging our schools to be thinking differently with more awareness of the way in which they are educating and working with young people, with more awareness of that hidden messages that they're giving them, that they need to be making conscious. Richard spoke about moving from the unconscious to the conscious in our messaging, and that really stuck for me in terms of us really thinking in schools, how are we doing that? And so just in closing, it feels for me that as we, each of us as adults, on our journeys, be that in organizations, be that in our homes, in our families, if we don't pay attention to the way in which we are educating our next generation of leaders, we're doing ourselves and those young people a disservice. And if we are wanting to be preparing young people for the co-creation of a different world, a world that is different to ours, we need to be doing things differently now. And so I'd really, with all my passion, invite you to go back to your organizations, go back to your communities, and think mindfully about how we are preparing our next generation to co-create the world they will both live in and co-create themselves.